Thank you for joining us for a panel discussion on the topic of post and transhumanism in art. When we talk about post-humanist or transhumanist art, we actually talk about new media art. That is this paradigm shift and new, let's say, form of art that appeared with the introduction of that was institutionalized with the introduction of information and communication technologies, the internet. So we are actually talking about a merger of arts, science, and technology. And these forms of art include virtual art, net art, bioart, genetic art, AI art, and similar forms in this line that include and that are based on whose production and exhibition is based on science and technology, actually on artistic collaborations with scientists and IT sector or biochemists and so on. We were supposed to have two more participants today who unfortunately had to cancel last minute, but with me today are two brilliant experts on the topic. Jovan Čekić. Jovan is a philosopher, art theorist, and conceptual artist. He's a full professor at the Faculty of Media and Communications of Singidunum University, teaching in the field of philosophy of art, deconstruction, digital art, and new technologies. He was a visiting professor at the Faculty of Fine Arts in Belgrade, the Faculty of Fine Arts in Cetinje, and the Faculty of Dramatic Arts in Belgrade. He is the editor of the art edition in the publishing house Geopoetica, and he has published numerous works in philosophy, art theory, and media theory. He organized 7 solo exhibitions and participated in many group exhibitions in the country and abroad. And he won Nadezhda Petrović Memorial Award in 1996 and the October Saloon Award in 2000. So Jovan is both in theory and in practice. And with us is also Stefan Lorenz Zorgner, who is also the keynote speaker at this conference, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk on Friday. He's a German meta-humanist philosopher, Nietzsche scholar, philosopher of music and art, I would add, and an authority in the field of ethics of emerging technologies. Stefan teaches philosophy at John Cabot University in Rome and is director and co-founder of the Beyond Humanism network. He's also a fellow at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, research fellow at the EVA Institute for the Humanities at EVA Women's University in Seoul, and visiting fellow at the Ethics Center of the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, where he was also visiting professor. He is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Posthuman Studies, and his most recent publications are We Have Always Been Cyborgs from 2021 and Philosophy of Posthuman Art, which came out this year. As an introduction, because I don't think that everyone here, because the topic of the conference is posthumanism, transhumanism, and anti-humanism in education. So I don't think that everyone here is familiar with artists and artworks that are representative of what can be called and is called now posthuman or transhuman art. So some of the examples, for example, I will just name a few pioneering artworks. Let's say Christa Sommerer and Lauren Minognon, Evolve, where you could actually virtually design some creatures that would and create the whole virtual ecosystems, or venturing into the virtual reality, such as the work Osmose by Shar Davies. And fast forward to today, we have the situation where artists actually migrate to metaverse, creating not only artworks, but the whole world, and basically designing experiences and behaviors. Most prominent, let's say, artists that could be labeled as post and transhumanists are, for example, Stellark, who uses robotics, microelectronics, plastic surgery, biotechnologies, genetic engineering, digital design, AI, and applies all these technologies on his own body to test the limits, and also to show the ways the body can be augmented, or as he says, the body is obsolete. So there is also Orlan, who uses plastic surgery to challenge the ideals of beauty. We have artists such as Eduardo Katz, who works with like biogenetic arts, some art collectives, and I think that Stefan and Jovan will also give more examples, but just to give you kind of a preview of what kind of art we are talking about. And these are, artists actually not only show us what technology can do, but they also point to the potential uses of the technology for better or for worse. Also make us think about our future. They bring to fore societal, cultural, also individual issues. They ask the question what the human is through their art production. So I will start with the first question, actually a group of questions for you. What is your definition of post and transhumanist art, and what is the relation between trans and posthuman theory and art practice? In other words, can we differentiate between the two, as Rosie just simply showed us the difference between transhuman thought and posthuman thought? Like, can we differentiate artworks in that way, or is it more fluid category in arts? And what kind of trans and posthumanist knowledge do these art practices generate? So is that?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, so the term posthuman art is one. I don't share sort of the understanding. Firstly, what Rosie Braidotti pointed out, and this is very important to highlight because she's painting a picture of transhumanism, which is very one-sided, which is very extreme. And actually, hardly any transhumanist actually corresponds to that notion of transhumanism, how she's presenting it. And sort of the way the posthuman art is being used, the term of the posthuman paradigm shift, actually stands, and here I'm in agreement with critical posthuman. It's about non-duality, getting rid of the binaries. And this actually applies to transhumanism, to metahumanism, as well as to critical posthumanism. And that is the important thing to realize. So when we talk about posthuman art, there are a couple of features which all of them sort of have in common. That's how we can classify the various artworks. It's not the case that sort of the artists themselves have to describe and subscribe to transhumanism or critical posthumanism. Actually, hardly any of them do so. And if they do so, then it's very often it's more ideology is not a very good work of art. And so the posthuman paradigm shift, what is it related to? So firstly, we see there's some notion of the posthuman which comes up, which is important. Secondly, in all of these approaches, metahumanism, critical posthumanism, transhumanism, there's an attempt to overcome humanism, to move beyond humanism. And humanism here as being defined as being rooted on categorical, ontological binaries. In the end, it goes back to the understanding that there's sort of the material body and the immaterial mind. And sort of that gets started probably, well, Rosie was saying that started with Descartes. I would, one could say that's already been the case in Stoic thinking. I would even trace it in particular to Plato's philosophy, the allegory of the cave where, the sun and sort of the sun and brightness and the cave and darkness. That's where all the dualities and all the discriminations which go along with the duality started. It's, the sun, rationality, which is the good, and then we stay here in the darkness which is evil, which is emotion, and of course rationality, that's a male notion, and then the emotionality, that's a female notion. So here we get all the types of discriminations. From sexism, the male-female distinction, from racism, sort of whiteness being the ideal, darkness being that what is being rejected, the evil. Speciesism, there's humans standing out. Humans have rationality, and sort of all the rest who are the non-humans, the animals, the others, who are being looked down upon. So we have a long-standing tradition in the Western world, and it's rooted in our language. Even just the subject-object distinction on which our grammar functions, that's all binary distinctions. And that's why it's also so difficult to moving away from the binaries. It's because it's so firmly instituted, part in our encrusted structures, in the language, in the culture, in a 2,500-year-long culture. And it developed further and became stronger and stronger. And so only in the past 200 years, we've moved away. We've started to significantly move away on a cultural level. And for me, sort of Darwin is a very important turning point, sort of classifying us as one among many animals. Then the next step would be, Nietzsche, who's basically turning Platonism upside down. And these are significant ways to move away from that binary thinking. And now in the 20th century, or at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, it's turning up on different levels and in different cultural spheres. So on the one hand, we've got the critical posthumanists who sort of try to conceptually, culturally, try to get rid of the binaries. But on the other hand, transhumanism does the same thing. Most transhumanists, and there are many sort of studies, empirical studies, surveys which show that most transhumanists subscribe to a version of naturalism. But naturalism meaning in the sense there's a rejection of, the human being rooted in the divine spark, in the immaterial rationality. This is what they get rid of. They have a monist ontology. And this monist ontology, this is clearly a sign of them affirming also moving away from a binary understanding. There's a difference of usage of language between critical posthumanists and transhumanists. Sort of, the transhumanists have more linear understanding, are more firmly rooted in the sciences, in technologies, and there's more, and they're more firmly rooted in the Anglo-American world of the sciences and technologies. That's why there's a different way of talking, a different way of speaking about science. I think it's more sort of trans and critical posthumanists. It's more a challenge with respect to the tradition you belong to. Are you part of that naturalist evolutionary theory tradition in the Anglo-American world? Or are you part of an outgrowth, and this is what critical posthumanism does, are you part of the continental world? So further development of Deleuze, of Foucault, and now moving towards non-binary ways of thinking in the cultural spheres. So where the transhumanists reduce everything to sort of everything becomes nature, and critical posthumanists, everything becomes culture. So in both ways, and that's something I've been showing, not the most recent book, the book before, We've Always Been Cyborgs. Well, basically both of them represent a monism, but both of them represent one side of the story. Both can benefit from each other, and one can learn from each other. But all of these attempts are basically attempts of overcoming binary ways of thinking. And what that leads to and what that means, this is really difficult. And the same now when coming to the arts, we see that this also happening in the arts. So when we move away from that subject-object distinction, which has a, obviously in the humanist tradition in the arts, now we move towards more performance. But even performance is not the right way of talking about that. Even performance has binary implications, because there's a performer and there's the audience. There's a subject and there's the object. So we're still stuck in this binary way of thinking. So one alternative way of thinking about it, of talking about it, is to talk about metaformances. Metaformance, meta meaning in between as well as beyond. And the metaformance is where there's sort of, the artists and audience are interacting. There's a permanent change in the artist's performance, which is a metaformance, sort of the audience is being included. Both get rid of their traditional roles. So just by talking about it, we see the challenges of moving away from the binary way of thinking. So metaformance is one way of attempting to do so. you mentioned Stellag as an example. Stellag is a very interesting case. Stellag is such a case, well, he gets invited to transhumanist conventions, and then among transhumanists, he's being celebrated as a transhumanist, and then he goes to critical posthumanists, and they all embrace him as a critical posthumanist. And I talked to him, and he said, well, he actually feels more at home with the critical posthumanist, but actually he's got many friends in the transhumanist communities as well, and he's been doing all the performances he's been doing before anyone was talking about trans and posthumanism. It's not that important. I mean, sort of the actual reflections about the issues. It's more about sort of the artistic practice which he's doing. And that is rooted in this, the body is obsolete, in this non-binary way of thinking and acting, in the non-binary way of doing art practices. So in the case, so that's why I'm using the term posthuman art in order to posthuman referring, it's sort of representing the posthuman paradigm shift. And posthuman paradigm shift in the end is rooted, well, in some way the notion of posthumanism is used. In some way, the various attempts try to overcome humanism, try to overcome binary ways of thinking, and in some way, technology becomes important. Some critical posthumanists don't agree with the final point, but even in that case, sort of when one talks about stresses, us being cyborgs, here it's also it's a technology-human distinction. Also, again, binaries coming together as not being seen as it also has non-binary ways of thinking has implications concerning how we see ourselves with respect to technologies. So posthuman paradigm shift is talking about the posthuman, overcoming, twisting humanism in some way, and talking about using technology as its third element. And so there are three different elements, but in the sense, as you said before, sort of with the various artists, it's very often, it's very difficult to classify, and this is transhumanist, this is metahumanist. There are elements of these, there are resonances in the various artists, and Stellag and Katja are the best examples maybe where you see each of the traditions that want to claim, you're one of us, but they don't actually, they have friends or they have influences from the very great variety of traditions, and it's not even that important how that they specifically classify. But the important issue that they want to move away and twist sort of the traditional. These binaries are being seen as a problem because they lead to discriminations, because they lead to paternalistic structures, and they have problematic universalist tendencies, and that is much more important for the artists themselves, so rather than actually sort of a clear and rigid categorization.
Actually, during the discussion, I wanted to point out at some point, which now is a good time, that these artists started practicing this kind of art before trans and posthumanism appeared as theoretical, philosophical categories. So basically, with Stellag, he started in the 80s, end of 70s, 80s, with suspensions, like hanging himself on the hooks. But afterwards, in the 80s and beginning of 90s, he started working with new technologies. Also, Eduardo Katz, in the beginning of the 90s, one of his artworks, no, I forgot the name, it doesn't matter, he chipped himself and registered himself as an animal, as a pet. In the veterinarian registry. So these are the projects and also other pioneering artists that I mentioned. They started working in the beginning of the 90s, dealing with the same problems transhumanism and posthumanism and critical posthumanism are dealing with today. So what is, I think, important in these kind of artworks, regardless of how they are classified, is that they bring up these questions and these issues that you were talking about. Yeah. Johan, how does this translate to art?
I think we can have maybe a different approach, and to see how artists use, new technology. Let's say nano, info, bio, neurotechnology, and what they produce when they are using that. then we can see how the artists relate to the future, how they see our future, what is the question they are asking, and according to our future. And then, of course, there is how they are related to the multiplicity, how they understand this world where we have so many things, you know, and which is on the first moment some kind of the chaos, you know, but actually they are flowing very nice and very good in that chaos and produce some interesting things. And of course, according to our speak, of course there is the problem how to transcend or going beyond that duality approach, you know. And for me, the most important things is how we understand hybrid products. Because if we are talk about, let's say, artwork, when we are speak about, let's say, post-human artists, we have a little problem. Because I think they do not produce artwork. They produce pseudo-objects or hybrid objects. And that's the objects which makes new relation with the environment, with people. So you cannot say, oh yeah, it is an art object. No, Stellark, he himself may be art object. You can say, oh, that guy is art object, but actually it's not. What Stefan mentioned, we have problem with the language. And our language, you know, our grammar force us to think on that way. Dualistic way, logistic way, let's say, you know, and things like that. So if we want to catch that hybrid reality, I think we have to approach to the art products like events. And we must realize how the cluster of, let's say, particles of event are connected with that work. Why? Because then we are start to think on a new way. And it was Whitehead, one very old and very nice philosopher, if you remember the guy, who he used to say, well, our language, when I say, let's say, I don't know, some Eiffel Tower, and you will say, oh yeah, it's an object, you know, 100 meters and things like that. But actually, it's an event which duration is about, I don't know, 200 years, maybe 100. So if I try to explain you that it is an event, and that event included tourist, French police, you know, new money for, I don't know, painting that again. So you will understand that it is some object, some event, which is not so easy to, let's say, recognize as a piece of art we used to think about it. So in my opinion, what is very interesting when we speak about post-human art is that some kind of artistic practice which can be traced in a modern period, maybe, where we have some kind of that approach. Crucial thing for that approach is avant-garde art, especially Dada, with assemblage, you know, with event, with, you know, try to destroy any boundary. So we have very different approach to the art with our avant-garde art. I mean, with that, I take just Dada, naturalism, you know, and Russian avant-garde. So if you are looking how that artists produce art, you will see that you have some kind of the anxious object in front of you. You don't know what to do. You have a little fear, you have a little anxious, you don't want to be stupid, you don't know what to do. And that's the new product of post-human art for me.
Right. Also, on this line of thinking, what is an artwork when we have this event, as you say? What I find interesting now when we talk about art practices, like what is art in these kind of artworks? What defines an artwork? Because many artists use new technologies, but there are so many. There's a hyper production of artworks that I call digital decoration, which are like impressive, immersive, but that's all there is to it. Like there's nothing more. There's no problem. There's no idea. It's just like what the technology can do. But what I think that makes an artwork is exactly the thing that makes you question, that pushes the boundaries, that brings invisible into focus. So this is something that these kind of artworks can be categorized as art. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, the event character is actually something, this is strongly resonates also with this understanding from the stability to its now permanent becoming, to which everything turns into an event. There is no more stability, and that recognizing, acknowledging that any stability is just a creation of our mind, nothing ontologically corresponds to that, and this is being brought out in the very great variety of artworks, which are not objects, which are not unchanging artworks anymore. They turn into events, exactly. And that's also when we start sort of just thinking about the notion of, I mean, bioart is very often mentioned sort of in the context of posthuman artworks, but even talking about, yeah, what does bioart stand for? Is it, you know, even to define bioart as something, does it have to be, I mean, is Stellar a work of bioart? You could say his arm, you know, that's a work of bioart. You know, he's alive, he's being altered. It doesn't only have to be. It doesn't only have to be the alba, the fluorescent rabbit, as a genetically modified fish which glows green in the dark. And though here again, it's also the event character. So it's not the fish as a fish, and the fish was alive. But then the fish died, and then maybe the process of decay is still being part of the artwork, of the event, of the bio artwork, as Albert the fluorescent rabbit, of the rabbit, not the fish. So here we could have a further understanding with bio art. For example, maybe it's sufficient. It's sufficient. Even a traditional sculpture could be classified as a bio artwork. And one of the wonderful examples is, and those who haven't seen the works by Patrizia Piccinini, they could be classified as bio artworks. So one of them, a very famous work of hers, is sort of the still life with stem cells. There's a little girl sitting on the ground, and sort of she's playing around with flesh, forming life out of stem cells, creating humans. And here we see again different resonances also. So on the one hand, the transhumanist resonance, in the sense humans are creating other human beings. You know, here the girl forming life, creating human genomes out of stem cells. But on the other hand, it is also the notion of doing something, bringing something together, which used to be a divine activity, the creation of humanity, now becoming, you know, non-dualistic, being done by the little girl, by other humans. And this goes back to the traditional, and both of the traditions, actually, what I find interesting, refer to Prometheus as the myth. And in Prometheus, again, we have both of these connotations. On the one hand, Prometheus in mythology was also the one who, as a human, was creating other human beings. But on the other hand, Prometheus was stealing rationality, was stealing the fire, and brought it to humanity. So here again, we've got the duality of the immaterial rationality of the fire, which is outside there, and rationality used to be seen as the divine spark, as the immaterial in us. And now Prometheus bringing this fire and attaching it and integrating it in a non-dualistic, in a Spinozian way to the human body. And we can see all of that, for example, in Patrizia Piccinini's artwork, Still Life with Stem Cells. Then we've got another work of hers where she created Graham. Graham is, I think, an absolutely fascinating piece where Graham is a sculpture. It is a monster, aesthetics of the monster, because when you encounter Graham, it was like, it's really the other, it's the ugly, it's something repulsive. On the other hand, what it's meant to be, Graham has been designed or created with the help of engineers. So they were supposed to create the shape of someone to increase the likelihood of surviving a car crash. So it would be the ideal driver. There's no neck, and because the neck is very dangerous, so once you get into a car accident, there's no nose, because once the glass in the windows, you enter inside and it increases the likelihood of you dying, and so on. So many features of the frame. So again, on the one hand here we've got the monster, but on the other hand a superhuman, because the frame has got the capacity of surviving that specific situation. We could also say it's a work of bioart, because here life, technologically altered life, is being dealt with in a traditional sculpture. So it doesn't have to be an actual living entity in order to be classified as bioart. Maybe even something like the impossibility of death in the eyes of someone living. Now, from Damien Hirst, the famous shark sculpture could be seen as a work of bioart. If we've got a formerly living shark plasticized in formaldehyde being put inside the box, so it's a wide notion. But it's always the event. It's the alteration, the becoming, which plays a central role, and different elements from critical and transhumanist thinking are being dealt with. It's not never the case. It's just the one, or it's hardly ever the case where it's just the one or the other. Because questions are being asked. It's not the prime reason. Is not sort of the answers which are given, because that would be ideologies now. Yes.
I think also that we can maybe look artists like, let's say, Chapman brothers, and then you will see something for me very interesting. That figure, which is, let's say, genetic modify, sculpture and things like that. But what is very interesting, they open some line to the Goya, to the famous, his work, Disaster of the War. And also they are making, next step to the Nazi concentration camp. So you see how the body, transform, how the, let's say, our biology, our connection with the body changed through the modern times, let's say. Even if you go further back to the history, you will see so many things. Also, you can have, let's say, artists like Matthew Barney, who is making, famous Cream Master Circle Yalta. And then you have also very interesting approach. Why? You have some kind of the, let's say, fragmented modernity, and you have some new men, or I don't know, artists, what you want to see, who is trying to make new connection between those fragments. And you see how the very new world starting to born. And his 5 pieces, which is very good, filmmaking, actually moving you not to have conclusion what's going on, but to realize that you are in the position of that something is starting to change. And you don't know what is change. But it's enough that you realize that something is changed. I think that is enough if you are look work of Barney.
Goya is a very important, it directly came to my mind. So to even see sort of these notions in music, that's actually a topic which is not so often being discussed, even less often than in the fine arts. But in music, there are also the post-human traces. And for example, there was Michael Nyman, and he composed the music for Gattaca, there's also Ian Gettiker, there was also, that could be classified as a transhumanist piano piece. There was like a piano piece written for a pianist with 12 fingers, genetically enhanced pianist. But he very often dealt with these topics. But he also created he also composed an opera which is called Facing Goya. And Facing Goya, where some scientists found the genetic traces, the skull of Goya, and there were still sort of genetic traces inside. They were able to take them and then to use cloning techniques in order to bring cloned Goya back to life. And there's like eugenics is being dealt with, and nurses and economists who are trying to make loads of money out of that. And so even in operas, we see sort of these topics, technology, the changes of technology are being addressed, are being dealt with. And he clearly, well, he talks about here, well, eugenics, genetic modification, he calls it eugenics. But it's clearly, so he talks about transhumanist technologies. But would that be a transhumanist opera? Well, not really, because it's an opera which is extremely critical of these technologies. It discusses the transhumanist themes, so it could rather be classified as an anti-transhumanist opera. But it sort of, it shows that sort of it falls into the range of topics which are also being discussed and dealt with in music drama. It's no longer just so here we can see that is part of the post-human paradigm shift. It becomes up in sculpture, in bioart, crypto arts, yeah. And now also in music. No?
Yeah, for me also one very interesting approach is forensic architecture. Yeah. You know, yes, especially approach to the event, because you have the group, not only artists. You have artists also, but you have a software guy. You have journalists, you have a lot of people who is trying to reconstruct some event. It is usually some, let's say, violence events. And then they are trying to exactly using top new technology to reconstruct what's really going on. And it is very interesting. Last thing which they are done is how we have, you know, some kind of the influence of toxic software on the reality, on everyday life with the journalists and so on. And they call that project, you know, digital violence. So what you have that some spy software, you know, can infect any equipment. It doesn't matter did you know, react or not. You are just infected, you know, and they can follow all your talks, photography, you know, everything. I mean, everything what you do with that machine, and that. In that case, you see how that something from virtual reality, you know, came in actual, and how they are influence our everyday life. So you have a Mexican journalist who have a lot of problem, you know, with the police, with the government, and things like that. And when you see how it functions, you realize that only if you are approached to some, let's say, art production as an event, it became something new, and in my opinion, it starts to have a very new sense, and it is important for us in this time.
It's actually it's actually a paradigm shift in aesthetics. Basically, because we can no longer, art is no longer a question only on the traditional notion of aesthetics, but its ontology has become cultural and social, and it functions as a mediator of social and cultural formations in historical and geographical actuality, basically. So now we are talking with these forms of art, we are talking about what, let's say, Simon Penny calls behavioral aesthetics, aesthetics of behavior, or the role of the artist is no longer what we have, like, is no longer the image of the artist that we have, like an individual who is, I don't know, what would be a typical myth of the artist. It does no longer exist because it's a collaborative network. Artists with IT people, with archaeologists, journalists, as Jovan mentioned. Basically, also Stefan in his book mentions different kinds of aesthetics that I managed to see from the contents, which are aesthetics of monsters, of hybridity, of the amorphous, of becoming, of twisting, and so on. So can you comment on this paradigm shift in aesthetics?
Yeah, I mean, sort of when it starts, in a world where the stability, where the eternal has gone, sort of with the post-human paradigm shift. So everything's becomes the event, becomes becoming. So just going back to the revised understanding of who we are as human beings, how it has changed. In the entire history, in the past 2,500 years, well, Plato and so on, we saw ourselves as human, as having this divine rationality spark, immaterial. That was our human nature. In the past 200 years, that dissolved in all the different respects. And dissolving means what was left of the human. So firstly, we started to realize, well, that what we saw, our rationality as being immaterial, is something which was evolutionary developed. Rationality is being a part of the body. It's not that we don't have rationality, we can communicate, but it was the result of an evolutionary development. Then next we realized, well, actually who we are, our human body, consists of more non-human cells than human cells. We've got 30 trillion human cells, human DNA, but actually we've got 39 trillion non-human cells which make up parts of our body. They're mostly in our intestines. Are they part of your body? Do they make up who we are? Well, we couldn't live without that. Then we see the further development concerning how we see ourselves. Well, what about the smartphone? The smartphone as our extended mind. A friend of mine with a cochlear implant, for example, he needs to adapt the smartphone to different environments. When he's outside, when he's a lecturer, he has a different program. He's got specific programs which enable him to hear stuff which normal people couldn't hear. Which it becomes part of who he is as part of his body. And if a policewoman took away his smartphone, he would see it as a damage being done to his body. The damage being done to his bodily integrity. So it's no longer the human body, which is a human body. It's a smartphone as an extension. Then as an extent, you mentioned sort of the virtual world with the metaverse. And here we see sort of again, it's the avatar. If someone rapes your avatar, if touches your avatar, is that you feel weird about that? Is that not a way also of doing damage, harming to your body? Isn't the avatar maybe also still part of who we are? So from the traditional anthropology, where we saw ourselves, the human divine immaterial spark as being our nature, now everything we have fewer human cells than actually humans. We have fewer human cells than non-human cells of party. And with the smartphone, we've got the rationality is a bodily entity. The virtual world becomes part of who we are. And that has consequence for the aesthetics, obviously. And for example, one example where the aesthetics of the twist comes up, a wonderful piece is the Second Life, by a wonderful performance by Stellark is the performance Second Life, where basically where he is being placed on a stage. He's connected to a computer. There's someone else next to him on stage who directs another avatar, and all of these. So they interact as part of the second world, Second Life, which is like the pre-runner of the metaverse nowadays. And then he's got a couple of other people in different parts of the world who act with different avatars. But all the interaction takes place in Second Life. And his own body is actually, half of his body is connected to the computer, and the computer sends out electronic impulses by chance. So he has got conscious control, consciousness, which is our human nature, which makes us special. Consciousness is only directing one half of his body. The other half of his body is sort of like moving, directed from computer impulses. So again, it undermines, it questions what is being left, where does human interaction take place? And the only interaction takes place here in the Second Life, in the digital world. So that is one aspect. So here, the aspect of twisting, of bringing, of not having the categorical dualities between the carbonate-based world and the silicon-based world as separate entities, but they're coming together. And they're coming together in an interaction. We don't know where the boundaries of our body actually are. They are fluid. And then that's being represented here in the aesthetics of twisting. And there are many of the other aesthetics with very different aesthetic representation. Yeah, the aesthetics of monsters, as you say, but also some others which might be seen as more problematic, but they're also part, and they might be more closely related to some transhumanist impulses, sort of the aesthetics of smoothness. That's again something, sort of the perfection, and that's the perfection as seen in the which we can see. We're surrounded by it, and people using the iPad, the iPhone, everything has to be smooth. Our body, we all, you know, the Brazilian vaccine 30 years ago, that was a fetish. Now everyone's doing it. It's a real change, and something which turns up in specific sexy robots, sexy robots being created as artworks, specific artworks which turn up in the Burning Man festival. We take a specific smoothness in the representation in Instagram filters, in TikTok, and that's another aesthetics which turns up in the arts, but as well as in the life world. There are also some very problematic implications, because like in TikTok, LGBTQ related content is being banned for the sake of everything becomes entertainment, everything becomes smooth. And obviously that's a very political move in itself. But it's another aesthetics which needs to be recognized as an important aesthetics of our time. It's not just because it's got problematic intention, it's dominant, it's widely being shared. But these are only two examples of many others. I distinguish 10 different types of aesthetics, but it's not 10, obviously, it's sort of, but I thought the 10 I mentioned were the ones most interesting, most relevant.
For me, maybe it's very important also to see in mind what Jelena mentioned when we talk about artists. They became nomads, but they are very specific nomads. I mean, they are moving through the different type of media, and they are, you know, nomads in his production. I mean, they can, you know, produce in a classical way, I don't know, painting and things like that. But tomorrow they can shoot, you know, a video or making a 3D graphic and things like that. So we have someone who started to think on a very different way. When he has some problem, then he chooses the media which will, let's say, the best, on the best way, make it visible, that kind of the problem. So I think that the differences between old and the new media is past, you know. Why? Because we have artists who is using everything. They don't care what you are thinking about, all new media, mass media, and things like that. No, they don't care. They just start to use it when they have a problem, and that's it. The second aspect of artists, and it is mentioned in Deleuze and Guattari books about Kafka, is they became, little by little, they became strangers. They said in one place about Kafka that he became some sort of a stranger in his own language. So I think that artists now start to be some kind of the stranger in his own culture, environment. Why? Because very soon we will see that we'll start something like, let's say, you know, new climate nomads. People who have to leave country because they cannot live there. The climate is changed. So we must now to start to think how to speak and how to think like a stranger. And I think that artist is doing that. Why? Because the stranger is on the line between not enemies but not friends. He's a very specific situation, very specific position. So that's the reason why he can see more than others. More than others, which is, let's say, you know, in that environment, in that politics, which is in that normality. That, I think, is very important to see that we have two new, very new, different aspects when we have art production.
And I think this is also a reason why with these sort of post-human artworks, that's a very good way, maybe even better than philosophy, of overcoming, of twisting, of moving away from the binary humanism.
Yes.
There's always been a close connection between, I mean, just to see the impact, if I go back in history, sort of when humanism came about, and for me, I once went to Epidauros, to one of the Greek a place, actually the only surviving satire play was performed then, and then I was there in this old massive theater, and then I realized the importance of coming about of binary distinctions and as related to art. Because if we see sort of the Dionysian celebrations out of which the theater has been created, what was it the case before the creation, the institutionalization of the architecture of the theater? There were groups of people running around and singing and dancing and celebrating Dionysus. There was not an architecture, there was not a distinction where like performers and audience were clearly separated from each other. But then suddenly
you are the part of the event.
Exactly, it used to be an event,
yeah.
And then suddenly it was institutionalized. We created an architecture was created 7 BC, 6 BC, and here we got suddenly the architecture separating the audience from the performers. The architecture remained a stable feature, so that encrusted structure, stability came about. On the stage, we had the protagonist and the choir. Another duality came about. So that was, I think it was an extremely important process during which actually this duality, the binaries, actually got established as something stable. And only like 100 years later, it was Plato with the Platonic ideas, with the separation from the world of becoming and the world of intellectual ideas. That only came 100 years later. But it clearly was sort of a sign of the times, the spirit of the time. So here we see a close connection, even the arts prefiguring what then took place in philosophy. And that took on much further, has an effect on Platonic thinking. Nietzsche said Christianity is Platonism for the people, and Christianity was dominant from up until, well, that's a question. It's still, the relicts, encrusted structures are still very effective. So, but it was very dominant up until the Renaissance, but even in the Enlightenment it was still there. So here we can see these dualistic structures really become part of our life world. And I'm just to see, if you look at the legal foundations all over the world, it's still the case that it's only humans who are seen as persons. Animals are seen as things, are legally classified as objects. And that is in all parts of the world. There's Argentina is the only country which started to recognize, which actually recognized personhood for an orangutan. As a consequence, the orangutan had to be freed from the zoo. They went on, sort of court cases were made in New York, in Vienna, in various parts of Europe. It was always rejected that apes were to be seen as persons. But just recognizing that it's still the case, only humans are persons on a legal level. That shows the impact of binary thinking, the incarceration. We still live in the binary world. It's not so easy to get rid of that. But this was sort of, and that goes back in the arts with the creation of the ancient Greek theater in like 566 before Common Era. And so here, yes.
We have to take care of the time. So I would like to wrap up the conversation with a final question and to bring it back to the topic of the conference, which is education. So what is the role of trans and post-human art practices in education, both formal and informal? And does post and transhumanist theories have a critical or subversive impact, specifically in art education and education in general, which is still dominantly traditional, that is humanistic oriented?
That was what I just said, sort of would have been just part of the answer. No? Exactly. I think people are more easily moved by the fact that philosophy doesn't really affect so many people. You don't change your behavior. Not many people, by reading, Singer has changed many people's mind. Peter Singer, sort of many turned vegetarian after reading Singer. That's not an effect many philosophers have on the environment. So, because it's just sort of that abstract reflection, it's just not something which touches the heart, sort of, which actually changes people to act accordingly. But when you engage with art practices, when you encounter works of art, it's sort of more also, it's not only an intellectual engagement, which you have, it's partly an intellectual, but it's also emotional conviction. You realize this is, you know, the direction in which you should be heading. This is, maybe you didn't realize, but you feel, you get actually emotionally convicted of something, and then that rather leads to action. So by engaging and including post-human arts in education, that might be more efficient, more effective, and making people aware of the problematic paternalistic structures and totalitarian tendencies which go along with binary structures. So yes, it is. I've developed a course on post-human studies at my university, and a third of the course is actually dedicated to the arts. And showing where it comes up from new media, bio art, in music, in cinema, in novels as well, and that makes, and then suddenly people, oh yeah, I love that artist, I love that, and they feel, and then they start to understand, and then they start to intellectually grasp also what critical posthumanism, what transhumanism is all about. By actually you're confronted with a specific example, and that even that helps you to theoretically abstract from that. So yes, it's definitely a way. It's definitely a very helpful way to reveal how strongly binary humanism has dominated the history of art, and actually makes more people aware of the problematic structures which go along with it as well. Yeah.
Johan, I don't know if you missed the question.
No.
It was regarding art and education. So what is the role of post-human art practices in education, both formal and informal? And does post and transhumanist theory have a critical or subversive impact, specifically in art education and in education in general, which is still dominantly traditional or humanistic oriented?
I think it's very important, and it has very important role, because it is the way how actually I have a course from postmodern to posthuman on the faculty with the students, and I have some experience. They are really start to think about future. When you start to ask some question, they start to think about future. Why? Because a neoliberal machine closing us future. we think how to live now and maybe tomorrow. Nobody knows what's going on, where you will be next summer. I will see maybe Greece, maybe Spain, maybe, I don't know, maybe I will not have money. We don't have future. We have probability. And that's the way how you push the young people to start to think about the future. Why? Because, what Stefan says, they must to start to think, no, it's binary, clear opposition. The world is gray, not binary black and white. Like Buddhist says, you know, there is no white, there is not black. And they have to start to think with that logic, you know. The open is most important, but open for the future. His own future, but the future of his country and humanity also. And that's how they are starting, you know, to make some a very interesting, you know, connection with the time. Because we also have a block of time. Look, everybody says, we have music from 60s, 70s, or I don't know, art from 60s, 70s. We think in blocks. We cannot make connection. Because why? Because it's music of 16, then I don't want to hear that. And you have very often when someone start to make an exhibition, they don't want to have artists from, I don't know, 90s. Why? Well, we want to have, I don't know, contemporary approach, blah, blah, blah. But you don't know what they are thinking. Maybe forever young, their function. I think that Dylan is think very good this time. Maybe better than most of the young artists. So we have a problem. Why? Because we have category, we have the separate things, separate approach. And I was once in some, I don't know, some speaks also like this, you know, with some American, now famous philosopher. And I said to him, oh, did you see, we talk all the time about multidisciplinary, blah, blah, but nobody speaks about multi-generation. He said, oh my God. So you see how it functions, like political unconsciousness. So I think the very important thing in education, especially with post-human, to open eye for that political unconsciousness.
In order to make them aware, maybe just a short comment, so to make people aware is actually to show students and asking them what is sort of binary, what comes to your mind having thought about binary humanism, about the lineup in this class? And then sort of you start to realize the same actually how this event is structured, how most events are structured. There's the subjects presenting and there are the objects listening. Audience, this is exactly the lineup. This is where the binary humanism, where we actually get confronted. This is how the encrusted structures, that's how a world is structured. And that's in order to undo this in some events as then while we're having the discussion, I will move around the room. And you all stand up on the chairs, lie on the floor, and you directly change it. You moves away from the traditional lineup, and you get a different visual perception, and you move away from the way you engage with each other in a non-binary manner. And that really makes people visually, emotionally aware of like how strong that binary thinking is categorizing, is structuring the life world we live in. No?
Thank you both so much for this engaging discussion. And what I'm going to do now is kill the binarism of the speakers and the audience and invite you to ask questions.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Oh, sorry, the microphone. Hi. So the whole time Stefan was speaking, I kept on thinking that you were going to get to the Dionysian thesis, this idea of like ritual, pre-structuring, prefiguring, the binary split that you. I mean, this is like Nietzsche's, right? Okay. So so is this the kind of ontological, like this is, how do you map artistic practices onto this ontological structure? Because if you start to say, well, posthumanism is about overcoming the binary, I was thinking the whole time, and then Jovan basically started talking about the event, well, we have situationalism, we have Brechtian theater, we have, if you believe Nietzsche's idea about Greek tragedy being about ritual, about this audience participation, which is disputed, right? Like it's not all classicists agree that this is how Greek theater worked in the 5th century. What does that mean about the urgency of defining posthumanism today? Because you're saying, and Jovan was saying, he gave a definitional concept, no, posthumanism is about, in art, is about producing artifacts, objects, not artworks. So I'm curious, you both actually have kind of different interpretations, I think, about what the posthuman is. For you, it's more about ontology, it's about bringing this Nietzschean idea of the Dionysian to bear on artistic practice, and for Jovan, it's about creating something that isn't artwork. I'm curious if maybe you could both respond to that question, which is maybe a little bit too broad.
I'm not so sure whether we're so different actually from each other. It's not about sort of the non-binary comes up in many different ways. So one binary notion is sort of the traditional notion of techne, then obviously on the one hand the arts, on the other hand the tech engineering parts. So that were clearly separated in the Middle Ages, and you have the arts to represent the eternal and the technology to help the world in this world. And now in bioart, techne in the sense of technology and the sense of arts comes back together. So we've got a non-binary in the way what is being in use. Then we've got non-binary in the way of, with the Second Life performance I mentioned, it's a non-binary with respect to the digital world, the silicon-based world, and the carbonate-based world. It's a different notion of non-binary. Then when we've got performances, metaformances, then there's a possibility of not having the stage and the audience, but you have got the orchestra wandering around, and it's not a traditional orchestra hall stage setting with the stage and the audience, but you need alternative spaces to perform that. So there is not one answer basically how that can turn up and how that can be dealt with. And it actually, and this is not something we didn't discuss here, but that's something which might also be relevant. So at least it often comes up in these discussions when we see, did anyone listen to the song which was created by Sony, Daddy's Car? Daddy's Car. It's a song which was created by, well, Sony Music. They have basically put all the Beatles songs together, and they develop by means of deep learning. The deep learning technology basically is a way, deep learning was the way how an algorithm managed to beat the best Go player in the world. So it's actually like us learning, it's an algorithm learning by itself, interacting in Go playing, interacting with itself, becoming as good as no human Go player is. And they've used that technology in order to create a Beatles song on the basis of all the Beatles songs which have been created. Which already exist, and it was a song created by an algorithm. And Daddy's Car, it's not yet, you know, it's not a top 10. It's not bad either. Actually, it's worth listening to. And that starts to then again, can we actually imagine? And I'm very hesitant concerning this possibility. But that's another way of the non-binary. Are there possibilities of then having AI artists coming about what's the origin? But there the intention is missing, and there maybe who actually isn't the artist the one who created that. But the results are extremely impressive, and we've had novels being entirely written word by word by algorithms, and they in Japan. And they've been submitted to short story competitions. And they were shortlisted among the top 5 best short stories written. The judges didn't know that it was an AI-generated novel. and as I say, I'm very hesitant of subscribing sort of the origin in sort of an algorithm attributing possibility. But it's very impressive what already takes place in this respect too. And we must bear in mind the internet has only been around for, the public use of the internet has only been around for 32 years. We live, digitally, we live in an embryonic state. And that means, I mean, historically speaking, we've been around sort of for 50,000 years, Homo sapiens for 400,000 years, and sort of digital internet for 30 years. And that means just that reveals the possibilities which go along with that. And that's another issue which, when we talk about the post-human art, which we definitely need to consider. I don't have an answer to that because we don't have a work of art really being created. But that raises additional questions which are extremely interesting to deal with.
Well, I think we must have new approach to knowledge. In my opinion, there is no only one way to approach that. Artists approach on the one way, theoreticians on the other. Someone can fuse it, someone don't. It doesn't matter. What is the matter is that we can, let's say, be open for those different approach. And when we, in a, I hope, near future, we have AI, then we will have some machine who has, let's say, presenting us that different approaches, let's say, on the best way. Because as human beings, we live in a very poor patterns. If you look at your life, you will see, every morning I stand up, I just go to buy something, I eat something, then I work something, then I go back home, and then and if you look your way of life, you will see you have just a few patterns. For I, it's nothing. It's borrowed. So if we want to do something, we must be open for very different knowledge and very different intelligence.
And uncertainty. Potentialities and uncertainty.
That might enable us sort of also to develop new sensitivities. I mean, sort of technologies and altering us by means of technologies might also enable us to develop further sensitivities, further central capacities, further ways of complexities of perceiving artworks, which we, and that's an example where, so here transhumanism actually is a way of it doesn't only make you bigger, stronger, taller, but it can create different aesthetic sensibilities and different types of experience by means of neuroenhancement, by means of taking drugs in order to modify one's capacities. So here we've got different brain-computer interfaces. So it's not only about the better, higher, faster. It's not about the Renaissance ideal 2.0, but it's just about having the possibility of making different experiences by means of technological alterations. So it's a possibility of enriching one's lives in the sense of new possible sensibilities, and that's I think a very fascinating field to explore.
Thank you for your question. There's another question back there.
No more questions.
Thank you. Okay, so I would like to get back to the fighting binaries, and my question is, well, there are some processes that are like supposed to be binary, like life and death, and others that are binary on their physical level. And how do you separate those that we actually can well, where we can fight the binaries from those that are impossible, where it's impossible to do. So, or are there options to maybe that's a not a very good example, but are there any mechanisms to deal to understand where it's actually productive to fight the binaries and where it is not?
Actually, sort of the life-death example, one thinks that's such a clear-cut distinction, and then you deal with sort of bioethical issues, and you start to reflect upon how is death actually defined. And death used to be defined as well the non-functioning of all the blood circular system of all the organs. And then suddenly, about 50 years ago, we realized, well, death has been redefined because we now have the possibilities of removing organs and transplanting organs. And as a consequence, in order to transplant organs, the body needs to be sufficiently alive still. So what did the physicians do? What did the medical ethicists do? They decided suddenly, well, death is actually once the entire brain is death, because the brain is necessary for conscious experiences. And so once the entire brain is dead, it's impossible to regain consciousness again. Isn't that sufficient for death? But then the entire sort of the cells are still alive. To define death, it's really difficult. There is no clear-cut distinction. And you see sort of how out of something then you eat again, then sort of so the decomposition grows into plants, you eat the plants. It is not as clear-cut as one takes it to be. In many circumstances, but as well, it actually is, it's a practical necessity to stick to some binaries. It is, I mean, and I see that, that's why it is overcoming binaries is not so easy. Just by using the words you're using, just by communicating, we use the subject-object distinction for communication purposes. The problem is, when it comes to the binaries, is that we take them as ontological essences, as something which is really there, which is unchanging. If we say in a specific event, this is unjust, then it seems to imply justice is something which is ontologically eternal. But then this is where it becomes problematic. Because once you try to conceptualize what actually this injustice is, and you describe that in words, then it vanishes again. So anything where we seem to have like unchanging essences, once you start to think critically about these essences, you realize they vanish. You cannot put that into words again. But on the other hand, we do have to communicate. And we do have to communicate. That's why we rely upon binaries, in that in our life world we are surrounded by them. But we need to see how they can be adapted, how they can be altered, and which others are the ones which are probably so firmly engrinded in our, which might not even be possible to get rid of. So it is much more complicated. So that's why that's a very important question now.
It's just for me, the non-binary is a new way to think within intensity, and that's the very hard for us. And that's why we decide to say that some intensity is black and the other is white. And that's how we solve the problem. But now, with the event, we have to start to think on a different intensity.
Yeah, I would have to start to think in plurality, which does not necessarily kill the binary. It incorporates it. The plurality incorporates the binary. So maybe that's how we widen and kind of make it more flexible in thinking.
Problems, I think, is really with the essence. We take the binaries to actually represent, correspond to something in the world, and then it becomes inflexible. Then we cannot move away from it so easily. It's a non-essentialism. which is more important than maybe the non-binary.
I have a kind of comment and a question, which also is about that categorical thinking, binaries, and as far as I know, currently the advances in complexity science, the mathematicians, they try to rely on fractals, which are more natural in sense of describing the real world, like fractal, mathematical fractal, which is the measure of roughness. And don't you think that applying some categories, mathematical descriptions of the world, which is, well, quite good sometimes, it's also kind of leading us to that universalism. So mathematicians are trying to apply something that is different from binary. This is here, it works. By the way, it gives us very advanced forms of art. Fractal is very nice thing to observe, but it's also universalism.
But mathematics is the best example, and that's already Nietzsche has talked about it. Actually, there's in order to demonstrate the implausibility of the existence of abstract objective entities. Just if we use numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, then we say we've got 2 classes here. As if there were 2 identical classes. But the classes are not identical. One is located here, the other one is located there. That the material out of which the class is made is a different type of class, which is this, than it is this one. So the number 2, any kind of, the number 3, is a type of abstraction which doesn't correspond to anything in the world. And this is why sort of that's a problem with mathematics. But the interesting thing is, using mathematics, then we do come to helpful results. So if I'm not saying mathematics is irrelevant, is unimportant. I'm saying the numbers don't actually correspond anything to the world, but they are sufficiently good, what we do with mathematics, what we do as a natural scientist, that they bring about where they are sufficiently similar. They work if we say, please bring me the 2 classes, someone's bringing me 2 classes. It's sufficiently good for communication purposes. It's sufficiently good if we do mathematical natural science calculations. You're not afraid of getting on the plane. Why? Because you know it works sufficiently well. The plane doesn't usually sort of you know get crashed. We trust the plane. But that shows it works. It works in the life world, but that doesn't mean that it actually corresponds to anything in the world. There's no direct essence which you find 2 classes which are absolutely identical. So it's a matter of numbers and words have a practical usage. That's why we use it in order to realize something. But once we start thinking about the correspondence to the world, it completely vanishes.
Well, it helps us to orient in one segment of the world. It doesn't matter, is it mathematics, grammar, or it doesn't matter. We need to be to orient it, and then we use it, as Stefan said. And I think it's a very good, but not enough. If we goes further, you know, we are now just on this small planet. But let's say in 1,000–2,000 years we will go further. Then it will not be enough. Maybe there is new mathematics, new logic, new way of thinking. So we have to be open for that. It is not fixed, it is not reality. It is an aspect of reality, and we are now function very good with that. And that's okay. If you agree.
Thank you all so much. Our time is up. Unfortunately, we could continue this conversation, I think, even longer. But yeah, we will be around for the next 2 days, so we can discuss during the breaks further. Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you guys.